Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. This week, we put out our 50th bonus episode on PPF+, the final episode in our series on George Orwell and the Second World War. Today, we're going to give you some extracts from some of the other episodes that will be available for you when you sign up to PPF+. All 50 episodes are there and waiting. We did this last summer. These are some of the more recent episodes on PPF+. What you're going to hear today are the philosopher Paul Sagar talking about his personal experiences of good and bad luck. Then it's me reflecting on the things that changed immediately before and immediately after the bomb fell on Hiroshima. Then the historian of film Harrison Whittaker discussing the relationship between It's a Wonderful Life and Sartrean existentialism. Then it's Hannah White from the Institute for Government explaining why British government does not work at the centre. And finally, the historian of Russia Edward Acton talks about how to understand the confessions in the Moscow show trials. It's an eclectic selection because we like to think we really are an eclectic podcast. A lot of people will be familiar with you and your writing, not because of what you've written about Adam Smith, but through your Substack, where you have written about your experiences. And you have, in part, written about this kind of monstrous bad luck, among many other things. And I am curious to know, now that you are on the other side of luck, whether it has changed how you think, not about the 18th century, because I don't suppose it has, but it might have done. If it has, I would like to know. But how you think about these questions of whether temperament draws you to a particular outlook or not. I mean, for instance, have your views on any of these questions changed? I think you'll have to say a bit about what we're talking about here for people who don't know, if you're okay talking about it.
I'm absolutely fine talking about it. As you say, I've got a Substack. I've pumped probably several hundred thousands of words into the internet about what happened to me and my attempts to come to terms with it after. So in some ways, my great love was always political philosophy, but really my great love was rock climbing. I used to do this obsessively. And then in the summer of 2023, I was in a catastrophic, I suppose we could in a way call it a freak accident, although given what I was doing in Scotland, in Glencoe, there was always a serious element of risk. So it's not entirely a freak accident. I got unlucky. Where I was climbing, the rocks that I was climbing shattered and broke, partly because I was in slightly the wrong place, but that was itself a function of bad luck because we were climbing at an extremely dry, unusually dry spell. So I went up the wrong part of the mountain. I was on terrain that I was extremely comfortable on, so I was taking it a bit, I was being blasé. But basically the rock shattered, I fell, and then the protective gear that I had placed, I was doing everything by the book, that all failed because the rock failed around the protective placements as well as the rock that I was climbing. So I fell, I'm told, I find this hard to believe, I'm told I fell 20 meters. I landed on my head, I turned my helmet, I was wearing a helmet, which is the only reason I'm speaking to you today. It turned into confetti, as my climbing partner put it. I then hit a ledge, so my hit on my head, helmet turns into confetti, destroy my left arm, almost lose the arm as a result because of the damage. But the really bad part is that I dislocated two of the vertebrae in my neck and gave myself a very serious spinal cord injury. So I have technically what's called a C6, C7 dislocation in the vertebrae, and it crushed my spinal cord. And the result is I am paralyzed from roughly the collarbones down. I have no significant sensation or motor control below the collarbones. I've got residual functionality in my hands. And so I'm now extremely dependent on 24-hour care. Makes it sound worse than it is because often they leave me alone for hours at a time and I just read and play on the computer. But I do need people to help me with everything. And I mean everything. And I don't want to disgust your audience too much who might be having breakfast, but it means help with everything. And so it was a colossal moment of bad luck. Having said that, I was doing something with known risks. I was choosing to put myself in a dangerous situation, but as my friend who was climbing with me said, it could have happened to me. It could have happened to any of our friends. You didn't do anything wrong. You just got unlucky. So I have experienced a colossal moment of bad luck in my life. The thing is, I'm not sure how So it was unlucky to fall, for all the rocks to break, and me to land on my head and dislocate my vertebrae and damage my spinal cord. But I'm not sure I consider myself unlucky as a result. I did for a long time. I mean, for a long time, just to be open about it, I didn't want to carry on. And for about 2 years after the accident was 2.5 years ago now, a bit more, I was pretty suicidal. I mean, not pretty suicidal, I fully was. And I joined Dignitas. I was pretty committed for a while of doing that. And when they said, oh, no, we won't accept you because you've got a psychiatric diagnosis of clinical depression, which was accurate, I thought, well, fuck it, then I'm going to go and jump. Well, I can't jump. I'm going to push myself in front of a train. And I wasn't far off, but I did get through the worst of it and I have overcome that now. And for a while I thought, was I lucky surviving that accident, or was surviving the worst luck possible? And I've now come to the view that I was very, very lucky, partly because the guy I was climbing with just happened to be a surgeon who worked at the hospital that I was taken to, which was only 60 miles away. They airlifted me straight off the mountain and got me in the operating theatre within 10 minutes of being in the ambulance. I then subsequently had a lot of good luck. I mean, I don't want to go into too much detail because we'll be here forever, but parents who supported me, enough financial security in the family, no further complications in terms of my recovery. I have no brain damage. Well, at least I'm told I have no brain damage. My parents were told he's probably going to be a vegetable or he's going to have serious impairments. And then after 2 weeks, they rescanned me like, oh, there doesn't seem to be any permanent damage. And then they woke me up and I was stir crazy for a week and they put me back in the MRI. I'm like, let's just double check. But no, he's just being very hyperactive. And then after a week, I woke up one day in the hospital and I was like, what's for breakfast? And the staff looked at me and they were like, are you okay? And I was like, yeah, where am I? And they're like, well, yesterday you were screaming about how we were all working with the Japanese to sell your organs on the black market. So this is a turnaround. And so I went from being crazy overnight to basically being pretty much normal. And so they've said they never really seen anything like it. And it took me a long time to come to terms with my injury. But things like, I've not lost my job. I have managed to continue in position at King's College London teaching and doing research. The vast majority of people who have an injury like mine, they lose their job and they don't go back to work. I have been able to continue teaching and writing, and I had to teach myself how to use voice dictation software. I had to do breathing exercises for months before I resumed teaching and lecturing, just so I could get through an hour. And as you've heard from this podcast, I have no problem talking anymore, but I had to do 6 months of breathing exercises to be able to speak for more than 20 minutes without collapsing from exhaustion. And forcing yourself to do that when you think, well, actually, I would rather jump in front of a train is not easy. And for some reason, I kept doing it, probably because I thought, if there's going to be any way of knowing if this is worth it, it's got to be going back to work, not simply getting a paycheck, but being motivated to teach, to keep thinking about ideas. I am lucky that I still have that. I am in contact with people who I met in spinal rehab who don't have that, who have lost everything. And I didn't lose everything. And so now I tend to think I had one moment of incredible bad luck. But within about less than 30 seconds of that bad luck, the good luck kicked in again. In the way that I was lucky to get into Oxford, I was lucky to get funding for my master's and my PhD. I was lucky to get my first position out of my PhD. I have one moment of bad luck and then the universe goes, don't worry, we've still got you. Yeah, you're going to be paralyzed, but you're not going to die and you're not going to have brain damage because your surgeon, the only person in the world that you knew who you climbed with, who could possibly have kept me alive, because my injuries were dramatic. And ever since that moment, despite it being an incredibly difficult 2 years, the luck has not left me. So I now think of myself as still incredibly lucky by the standards of most people. So I try not to dwell too much on that one moment. But has it changed my views about other things?
Has it changed your views about luck? Because the story that you tell, lots of luck and then one moment where the opposite happened. But it means that your story each way is highly contingent. To relate it to what we've been talking about, for some people, the motivation in thinking we need to start with questions of justice is actually because they want less of the outcome of people's lives to be contingent in that way. Now, this could go all sorts of ways. The lucky early part of your life, you got funding to do what you loved. A lot of people who are interested in justice want everyone, and maybe if not everyone, more people than currently, to have the funding to do what they love, or at least in the Rawlsian version of political philosophy, to have, particularly those who are the worst off, to have better life chances, meaning the opportunity to follow the path that they would follow, other things being equal, if resources weren't an issue. On the other side of your accident, for some people who lost everything, the basic security, not political order, stability and security, but the basic security that a human life needs for even minimal flourishing, for many of them will not have been there. And some people, again, would think this is a problem of social ordering and social justice. We need to take better care of the victims of bad luck. Now, I'm not even asking you whether your views on those things have changed, but does that framing speak to you or not?
So it does to some extent, which is actually, yes, I think a world in which we looked after the unlucky more than we do in many ways at the moment would be a better one. Now, there are all kinds of difficult questions there about resource constraints, prioritizing people. But in general, yes, I think something like a bigger welfare safety net, which can look after more people who are caught unexpectedly. And it can happen. I mean, this is the thing that I learned with my injury. I'd always thought, oh, that'll never happen to me, because everybody thinks like that, because you can't get through. You wouldn't leave your house unless you thought like that. But then some of the stories that I've heard from people directly who've had these, the amount of crazy accidents that have happened to people who end up with things like spinal injuries, it can happen to anybody. And something like, for example, the NHS that we have in the UK is best thought of as a giant institutionalized insurance system, so that if, like me, you end up with incredible bad luck, you don't fall, completely out of the bottom and end up just abandoned. There is something there for you. And I personally would wish there was more than there is, because if I hadn't been as lucky as I have in terms of my family background and the support I've received, I mean, I consider myself sort of boringly middle class from the north of England, but my parents were able to step in and willing to step in at that crucial point. And that's luck, because I've seen people who've been largely abandoned by their families when they've been in a situation like mine. And I would rather a social safety net which meant people were less dependent on having the good luck of family. Where a lot of political philosophy for me, I think, goes wrong is in thinking that if we really think really hard about the unfairness of luck and the ideal institutions for correcting that, we can eliminate more luck than we can. My view is there's still going to be a tremendous amount of bad luck going around. And instead of trying to regulate all of it and eliminate as much of it as possible, we just kind of should say, well, look, there's going to be a lot of it, but given that there's going to be a lot of it, let's try and put more provisions in place to catch more people more effectively than we currently do.
Part of what is so fascinating about his account is that he doesn't just describe the bombing and its aftermath, but you get on the day, he begins on the day, a glimpse of what Japan was like before the bomb dropped. At the end of the war, as we know now, very near the end of the war, but they didn't know that. On the 6th of August, 1945, before 8:15 in the morning, when everything changed, the people of Hiroshima were going about their ordinary lives in a country that was clearly losing the war and was preparing for a potential American invasion, but was not in any sense preparing for surrender, was not in any sense anticipating that this war was about to come to an end. Of these 6 individuals, they were already leading pretty tough, difficult lives. Many of them were sick before the bomb went off. Hersey describes the various ailments they were suffering from: diarrhea, malnutrition, food was hard to come by. This was an extremely difficult place and time to be trying to function normally, but he also describes the complete normality of their everyday existence. The children were still playing and being educated. Mrs. Nakamura was still worried about clothing them and feeding them, but who doesn't worry about clothing and feeding their children, making sure that they were safe? Dr. Fuji was drinking his whiskey. Miss Sasaki was going to work in her factory. Dr. Sasaki was preparing for a day in his hospital. The hospitals were not full. Part of the strangeness of the atmosphere in Hiroshima before the bomb went off was that everybody was anticipating an attack. There was a real consciousness that Hiroshima had been spared and it couldn't last much longer. Everybody knew that other cities with infrastructure had been firebombed. They knew what had happened to Tokyo. And there was a feeling that they had been lucky, but it didn't make sense. And so the fear was of a B-52 bomber raid. That was what everybody was looking for, looking to the skies for. Work was being done in the city to prepare against what they thought would be a firebombing of the city. And the only defense for that was to build fire lanes, to pull down buildings, to try and prevent the fire from spreading. Many people on the 6th of August, including groups of schoolgirls who had been taken out of school to help dig and prepare fire lanes to protect them against the attack they knew was coming. Japanese soldiers in the city were digging themselves into the hillside around Hiroshima in order to prepare for the potential invasion that was to come. The rationale of the bomb on the American side, which was to end this war, we have to do this terrible thing because a Japanese defense of the homeland would be worse, would cost more American lives, would cost more Japanese lives. That's what Hiroshima was preparing for. Schoolgirls in the street, digging. Soldiers in the hillsides, digging themselves in. People were on edge. They were sick. They were on the lookout for the attack. They had absolutely no idea what was coming. But the other thing that's eerie about this account is the very ordinariness of it also highlights, and Hersey, no question, goes out of his way to touch on this, how to an American readership, this is still not a society, this is not a place that they are familiar with. Hersey seems to be trying to do two things in this book. He needs to humanize a people, the Japanese, who have been dehumanized during the war. But he also needs to recapture the strangeness of what is about to happen to them. So it's helpful, I think, for him in his account, just to remind his American readers, before they get too comfortable with these ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, that this is still a strange place. It is an unusual place to which something uniquely, or almost uniquely, if you include Nagasaki, strange is going to happen. So, for instance, he records that Father Kleinsorge, who had lived among the Japanese for a long time, was uncomfortable in August 1945, and it was becoming less easy for him to be in that country and in that city as a German among Japanese. Now, an American readership might read that and recognize exactly what's going on here. It was pretty difficult to be a German in the United States or, say, in Britain during the war because Germany was the enemy. It was extremely difficult to be Japanese in the United States during the war. Many Japanese American citizens found themselves interned during the war. This is not what's going on for Father Kleinsorge. His problem in Japan in August 1945 is that his Japanese neighbors are viewing him with suspicion, not because he is the enemy, but because Germany was meant to be an ally, and the Japanese are disgusted that Germany has surrendered. Germany has given up. The Japanese have no intention of surrendering. Germany caved. Hitler is dead. Kleinsorge represents a people who abandoned the fight. That version of being a German in the wrong place at the wrong time is completely alien to the American experience. Or to give another example, in describing the morning of Miss Sasaki in the tin factory, Hersey reports that she arrived at work early because she had to prepare the auditorium in the factory for the workers to gather to celebrate a man who had just died. And there was going to be a memorial service to commemorate his heroic death. The man who had died was a prominent local naval official, and he had committed suicide. He had thrown himself in front of a train. And for the people in Hiroshima, this was so noble a death that work would stop so that everybody could gather to commemorate this man, this heroic suicide. A completely alien experience in a Christian culture. Hiroshima both was and wasn't familiar. And then, at 8:15, everything changed. These 6 individuals describe the experience in similar terms. Noiseless, overwhelming light. And also for all of them, because they had no idea what had happened, their belief that they were both unlucky as well as lucky, in the sense lucky because they survived, unlucky because they thought that they must be very near the center of some attack. a bomb must have dropped on or near the building that they were in. There was no warning of any kind of this bomb. In Hiroshima, people had been on alert for warnings for days and weeks, constant sirens and alarms, people having to go in and out of shelters. On the morning of the 6th of August, no warning had sounded. There was no siren or alarm because there was no evidence of an imminent attack. Many individuals in the city, including some of these survivors, had noticed earlier that morning a plane fly over, which they assumed was the regular weather reconnaissance plane. And then some people were aware that a group of 3 planes was also flying over the city. 3 planes is not enough to do any damage, particularly not from that height. So it was assumed, as often had been the case, that this was another reconnaissance party, maybe preparing for an attack that was to come. There was no sense that the attack was imminent because everybody knew what to look for an imminent attack, a fleet of B-52 bombers coming to destroy their city. So at the moment of the blast, it came as a complete surprise to all of these 6. But they knew their city was in the firing line. They'd been hit. It must have landed somewhere near them. Maybe it was just a one-off attack, maybe just a few planes. They were unlucky. It seemed to have targeted their neighborhood, their suburb. It wasn't the center of the city that was being attacked. It was their bit of the city that was being attacked. But none of them had time really to think about what had happened. They immediately embarked on the battle for survival. They were lucky in the sense that all of them were protected in some way by the buildings they were in or near. People who were out in the open, even at the distance they were from the bomb, would not have survived. Some of them were buried in rubble. Mrs. Nakamura had to dig her children out of the rubble of their home. Some of them were protected by falling masonry. In the case of Miss Sasaki, she was both protected and crushed by a door that broke her leg. But nonetheless, that door protected her from the full blast. In their different ways, purely by chance, they survived, some in terrible pain, some more or less uninjured, all of them deeply shaken, very distressed, but determined to try and find out what had happened and also to protect themselves as best they could, dig themselves out. And so each of them got on with the business of survival with no idea at all of what they were dealing with. And then Hersey describes, by first of all hours, then by days, the gradual beginnings of a realization of what had happened. But it comes in stages. There is no moment where they come face to face with the reckoning with this thing, both with their own survival, but also with the horror of what's happened around them. It just comes in these little pieces of information or experience. To start with, it's the beginnings of a realization that they are not at the center of the attack. Do you think this film does have anything to do with existentialism?
I do. If you thought my version of compatibilism was vulgar, then plug your ears. If you've ever said the phrase mauvaise foi, you're not going to like everything I have to say after here. But I do. You know, I mentioned to you before that this film came out in the same year that Sartre published Existentialism is a Humanism, which is the most accessible, perhaps again the most vulgar form of existentialism he offered to the public. But in it, you know, he has the famous existence precedes essence line, which, again, to take in the most workaday sense, I think this film is really invested in as an idea, insofar as, for George, essence precedes existence. He has already, you know, early in the film, he has made up what his life is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a life of travel, of success, of ideas that are inherent to his living a good life, and that those two things cannot be unwedded. Fast forward to Clarence showing him that actually existence is the only thing, and meaning comes thereafter. And if you take away existence, which of course, you know, the most famous aspect of the film, Clarence does, then you realize that all of the meaning that you had once ascribed to your life, that you saw yourself as lacking, goes in the absence of existence.
I mean, it makes sense. Is it a coincidence? I'm guessing Capra didn't read Sartre, but this is 1945-46. These ideas are in the air. These are, apart from anything else, these are ideas coming out of a world that has just been convulsed by war.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying Capra read Sartre, though I would love someone to tell me that there's a possibility that he did. It's more that there's an interesting confluence, and ultimately probably not a coincidental one, with the post-war individualism that Capra was so interested in, and the post-war continental form of existentialism that I think, in a way, valorized the individual. The individual was like so important for Capra as an idea. A quote from this is in the margins of one of his scripts. He says, "It is the individual that must be built up in his beliefs, his hopes, his aspirations, and then as a matter of course, you will find the new world we all talk about developing in the larger way." I mean, he really believed these things, which is so strange given also the communal aspect of the film. Again, he loves the idea of Bedford Falls and of the mutual investment going on. And yet for him, it is ultimately all about the individual and the choices that the individual is benighted to make.
So it is a community of individuals in that sense. This is the communalism of individualism, which is one of the ways in which it can't really be a communist film, I think. I mean, another of the ways in which it can't really be a communist film is that clearly Mr. Potter is not a good example of capitalism in action. But there are a number of features of Mr. Potter, one of which, and many people have pointed this out, the film effectively breaks the Hollywood code because at the end of the film, the person who commits a crime is Potter. Potter steals the money. Uncle Billy's money falls into a newspaper. Potter finds it and he takes it. That is theft. And then he uses this to extort and extract from the Baileys. Ultimately, he hopes to shut down the savings and loan and take it over. This is simply criminal behavior from end to end. Now, he doesn't get away with it in the sense that he doesn't shut the savings and loan, but he doesn't get what you're meant to get as a criminal in a Hollywood movie, which is comeuppance. He doesn't appear in the film after the point where he has effectively cooled down the wrath of every institution in the United States, from the press to the forces of law and order, onto the Baileys, and then he vanishes. Potter doesn't get his comeuppance.
No, he doesn't. And in its place, Capra gives us sort of two competing and contradictory forms of recompense. So, in many other films, Potter would have either, gotten arrested and found out, or reformed and said, no, I see the true meaning of Christmas. Here's your 8,000, Instead, what we get is, of course, I think the most moving sequence, which is all of the people in the town repaying back to George in order to save their bank. But then also we get the final telegram from Wainwright, the good capitalist, saying, I've got $25,000 at your disposal. And there's something funny about him being involved in the new industry of plastics. I think Capra's almost saying, we don't need to reform anything because actually society's moving on. We can forget all these old avaricious bank types because now we've got plastics magnates who love poor people.
And also the bank examiner, who's a not particularly sinister figure, but he's deeply unsympathetic. Again, by this point, anyone watching the film is probably crying so much anyway, there's not much more to come. But the bank examiner puts his hand into his pocket, shrugs his shoulders, and throws something into the pot. And I have to say, when I was rewatching it, because it's a long time since I've seen it, I suddenly found myself thinking, oh my God, is Potter about to show up and throw the 8,000? I thought, have I forgotten that it seems like where this is going to go, right? As you say, the classic Hollywood arc, if Potter's not going to go to jail, is that at the very end of the queue, he's there and he tosses Uncle Billy's money back into the pot, but he doesn't. You think he's just being consigned to history rather than to jail?
We don't even, our last shot of him is when George Bailey wishes him a Merry Christmas and Potter says, in a Happy New Year from jail or something like that. It's a fantastically brief and bitter last image. But Capra felt, and he said this, that he just didn't think that story needed following up on. He thought that the outpouring of goodness more than made up for whatever lack of punishment Potter received. I don't know if I agree, but I can see why he said that, given everything else he said about this film.
The thing that Potter embodies in the film is not simply or even mainly avaricious capitalism, and it's certainly not a faith in the idea of money, because most of the characters have that, and George to some extent has it too, right the way through the film. He never becomes someone who has lost his interest in the hope of living a comfortable and prosperous life. What Potter represents is monopoly power, essentially. So the threat he poses to the town is, as he gathers into his little empire all of the institutions that would otherwise have provided relief from being in hoc to Potter. And then the savings and loan, its value is not simply that it's a place that less well-off people can pool their resources and then take money out when they need it. And it's not simply that the savings and loan is based on George Bailey's judgment of character. So we get a lot of that. He lends money to people because he knows they're good for it. And he doesn't require some kind of form to prove it. He's as good as his word or his handshake. But it's also that the savings and loan becomes the last place where you can escape from the domination of Potter. So to use another pretentious term from philosophy, from political philosophy, this is a film about the theory of non-domination, which is one argument, which is the way to define freedom. The real test of freedom is whether under conditions in which you might otherwise be at the mercy of arbitrary power, there is an out. There is somewhere you can go to get out from under arbitrary power, because if you can't, in that theory, you are literally, as well as metaphorically, a slave. And the thought is that without the savings and loan, Potter is enslaving this town, not just by gouging prices and having slums and forcing people to pay rent, but simply by giving them nowhere else to turn. And that does feel to me like, in some ways, a really strong theme of the film.
Yeah, and the film bears this out, right? Because in Bedford Falls, there's Bailey Park, which is a sectioned off portion of the town that, has these savings and loan homes, but it is discrete unto itself. And one of the characters in Potter's office at some point says, I used to hunt squirrels there. So we get the sense that there's sort of this end of enclosure. Bailey Park is an aspect of Bedford Falls. Of course, then in the dark version, it somehow becomes Pottersville. It is completely subsumed, as you said. It is. I don't know at what point the town decided to rename itself in this version. I don't know how that happened, but it did. And we now see that everything is under the thumb of Potter.
Except perhaps the library, but then we're meant to believe at this point is the library is where Hope goes to die, because it's where Mary leaves her miserable spinsterish existence. If the library was once a place that you might find relief from Pottersville, now the thought is Pottersville is so grim that the only place to go to get away from it is the library.
I know, but still oddly genuous of Capra to believe that in the face of total capitalist domination, the public libraries will still maintain their independence.
So I've asked you about politics, I've asked you about philosophy. What about religion? Each time I've seen it, there's a part of me that recoils very early on at the twinkling stars and just the bit where the heavenly creatures are talking to each other. It's so naff. It's almost unwatchable.
In practice, given all the different things that government does, you have to draw boundaries somewhere. You're not going to have just one big government department that's doing everything. And if you did, it wouldn't work very well. So you're always going to have certain boundaries. You're going to think of a certain machinery of government that you're going to opt for. And the question is, when you draw those boundaries, what are the mechanisms for working across those boundaries? And for the Labour government, the idea of missions was supposed to be to tackle this long-standing, widely acknowledged problem, the idea of having big national objectives that you would bring together people from across government, but also beyond government in order to tackle and have a whole sort of civil society, academic, private sector, everyone pulling together in pursuit of a common goal, and that having that high-level objective but also accountability structures built in would enable you to do that. I would say that there's no evidence yet that we've seen a step change in how government is working to achieve that. But the idea was precisely to tackle that question, that problem that you identify.
So how would you tackle it?
Well, I think the idea of missions is a good one. And I think at a smaller scale, in local authorities and so on, it has been demonstrated that it can work, that having those very clear high-level objectives, relatively fewer higher-level objectives, with good accountability structures which hold people to account for their working together, not just their achieving of an objective, can be very motivating, can help with the clarity of sort of vision of what you're trying to achieve, and can mean you're marshalling all the different resources available in pursuit of a common goal. But I think that the problem that Labour encountered was that they don't appear to have thought through adequately ahead of getting into government how they were going to set up the apparatus that was going to achieve this. They ended up opting for relatively conventional cabinet committee sort of structures, putting the Secretary of State, who was the lead Secretary of State for a given mission, in charge of that cabinet committee. So really they weren't being held to account, except occasionally by the Prime Minister. And really it has ended up being that each mission is largely being driven by one department, and that emphasis on joining up, which also needs, and I will maybe come on to talk about this, but needs to be reflected in the way that government makes decisions about how it spends money, hasn't happened to the extent that we would have liked.
So on that point about how government spends money, but also, as you said, one of the ways this can end up working is that the person or the part of government that has to coordinate across the piece is inevitably the Prime Minister, the executive. It ends up reinforcing the view that if we're going to do this, but we're also going to get a grip on it, we have to empower the office of the Prime Minister, and we have to empower the people who work around the Prime Minister. And then you get almost the opposite effect of the one you intended, which is you just end up back with things gravitating towards the centre. Then in the British system, the other complaint that's often made is that too much of this depends on the Treasury, and the Treasury kind of squats at the centre, not as a institution that coordinates and joins up and allows people to see how everything connects, but just as a kind of great dark cloud, stopping people from doing the things that they want to do or pointing out the reasons that the money isn't there. And that the power of the Treasury is a barrier in the way of this. And then British politics, and it may be repeated in other systems as well, I imagine it often is, becomes a contest between the executive trying to assert its centralising control and the people who control the money trying to say, you can't do this because there isn't enough money there. And that doesn't feel like joined up thinking. That feels like just being stuck.
Well, I think it's not always, it has been very visibly sometimes, as you say, a contest in British politics when you've had a strong Prime Minister and a strong Chancellor. It can just be a default. I think the issue about the Treasury is that it is a very strong and effective institution with established ways of doing things. And it tends to step into the breach in the absence of other direction. And so if you don't have a strong direction being set from the centre, from the Prime Minister in terms of priorities, your priorities end up being set by these very established processes that the Treasury has, which, as you say, tend to be about bilateral relationships with different departments rather than a strategic sense of where government is going as a whole. To go back to what you said at the start of that question, I think the sort of problem we have in UK government is that it is a very difficult combination of both highly centralised but also having a weak centre. So we try to do a lot of stuff at the centre, but the centre isn't strong and strategic. So almost everyone agrees that we need to decentralise in theory, and we've got in England a new mayoral system which is sort of attempting to do that, although not much in relation to money yet, and so that is definitely a work in progress. And yet you have prime ministers who find that they're sitting at the centre, but really the power and capacity sits in departments, and you have permanent secretaries, top civil servants who work as secretaries of state who are pursuing their own agenda, and that's where their primary allegiance lies. And then you have the Prime Minister with their cabinet secretary sitting at the centre trying to sort of direct departments, but really they are at that point just the primus inter pares, and they can't necessarily get that sort of strategic grip on the system. And if they are not doing it, then when it comes to spending reviews and when it comes to spending decisions, the strong Treasury ends up making those decisions for you by making decisions about money. So, the work that we've done on the centre has argued, as many others have, that what you need to do is have a stronger department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, which would provide more of a counterbalance to the Treasury and have a bit more economic capacity in number 10 to give a sort of challenge function against the Treasury, but also have to build up a department of the civil service run by a First Secretary of State who would almost be like a chief operating officer for government. So if you think about the Prime Minister as CEO, the Chancellor as CFO, what British government doesn't have at the moment is anyone in the role of COO. You don't have anyone who's actually running the thing. You have a whole series of secretaries of state sitting in that space, and that means it's very difficult to remain strategic. You end up with lots of case-by-case decisions coming out rather than a strategic overview of what the priorities of government should be.
Or you have a Prime Minister's Chief of Staff trying to play a version of that role, but it doesn't really work because that is so obviously a different kind of function. Am I right?
And because there's often then a lack of legitimacy to that role and pushback about their ability to do that. And even if they apparently have, and they don't always have, the backing of the Prime Minister in doing that, it's quite easy for individual secretaries of state and permanent secretaries to push back and say, well, that's not, I don't accept that, so we're going to do our own thing. Thank you very much.
Is Britain very unusual in the situation, the problem that you just described, both highly centralised and also weak at the centre? Does that make us an unusual kind of state? In some ways, it feels like we are the opposite of the United States. The United States is a highly decentralized system. It's a federal system, but it's very strong at the center. The president does have really serious power. I mean, also frustrations. Presidents apparently also complain that when they say do this, nothing happens. And the current president may be experiencing that too. But still, it feels like Britain is unusual in the extent to which the traditions that we have and the focus on Parliament and the Prime Minister and the way the executive relates to the legislature places a great premium on central control without having provided the mechanism.
I think I would say we are uniquely poorly placed on that. I mean, other Westminster-style democracies try to empower the Prime Minister in different ways. In Canada, you have an entirely political department of the sort of Prime Minister at the centre, where all the special advisors essentially sit together, and then you have a sort of a twin version of that, which is entirely official, which is doing the sort of driving of the government. Everyone is trying to solve this problem, but I think one of the allied issues for the UK is that because of our parliamentary system, which, as we've discussed, governments want to get their agenda through. One way to help yourself do that is to have a larger payroll vote, to have more people who have some kind of role in the government for which they're being paid, whether that's a ministerial role or as a whip or some kind of trade envoy or something. That payroll vote has grown and grown in the UK system. So we now have often cabinet meetings attended by around 30 people. It's very hard to be strategic, as you may have discovered potentially, David, in academic institutions, to be strategic in a group of 30 people. And so one of the things that we've argued is that it would be better for prime ministers to acknowledge the reality which comes through to most of them at some point in their governing careers, that actually they need a smaller group of people with whom to make really key decisions and trade-offs, and to acknowledge the fact that actually what most prime ministers end up with, however formal or not it is some kind of executive cabinet. And we've said, well, why don't you acknowledge that fact, resource it properly, give it a secretariat, and say, actually, when we're trying to make big strategic decisions, those go first through an executive cabinet, and then they can go to the full cabinet. But if you're going to maintain this system of patronage, which enables you to get stuff through Parliament more easily because you're paying lots of people for a role in government, don't then try to use that to make big strategic decisions, because that's never going to work.
One of the reasons that people are fascinated by his case is there is a view that of all of the defendants in these trials, he was the one whose confession contained within it some resistance, in the sense that his confession is different from the others in what he agreed to confess to and what he refused to confess to. But also it's been read as having almost a secret code in it, that unlike the others, he was still pushing back at the end. Now, I have read it. It's a celebrated, this is his final speech from the dock. It is a celebrated document, and it was part of the inspiration for the novel that we're going to talk about, Koestler's Darkness at Noon. Do you think, I have one or two things, I'm not an expert on this, just reading it in its own right. One or two aspects of it did strike me as different from some of these other craven confessions. Do you think it's different in kind from the others?
Oh, yes, I do. It's very intellectual. This is 3 days before he is executed. He knows he's about to be executed. And yet he speaks for an hour. Well, it's 6,000 words, and he spoke so fast that probably less than an hour. And he's thoroughly coherent, and he draws on very upmarket literature. And he weaves together denial of specific charges. No, I did not plan to assassinate Lenin. No, I did not do that. No, that character, that co-defendant down there who claims this, it's not true. And no, I couldn't have done that. I'd never heard of him. But I am morally and politically responsible for everything. So he combined the two. And in a way, it's very close to Bolshevik language, that politically, objectively, he is on the side of, or found himself because he criticized Stalin, those who are against the regime. But in the specific instances, he bravely and boldly and in front of Wyszynski, who is very, very sharp, holds the line. So I think it is very different. A code, I think, is too strong. I quite agree with you. There are those who think he was trying to turn it into a sort of counter-trial of the regime. He's too completely abject in his acceptance that we fell into the wrong side of history, I think, for that to be convincing. The analogue is with socialist revolutionaries and populists in the 19th century, and they never would have said anything vaguely analogous about the Tsarist regime. So I don't think that holds. But it is not simply my party right or wrong. No, he's jolly well going to correct some things that he will not accept.
Even if it's not code, it is possible to read it as in part mocking the whole process in the sense that he denies the specifics. Now, all of these trials, if we go back to the one that we talked about in 36, it's all about the specifics. It's all about building a narrative on the basis that he said this and he said that and he did this and he did that. And you can see how it all fits together. And out of the little pieces, you get the grand conspiracy, you get the crime, the overall crime. And here he is, I think, uniquely in these cases, denying the specifics. Everyone else more or less agrees to the specifics and then they can't deny the general. He denies the specifics but agrees to the general. So no, I didn't do any of these things, but clearly I'm guilty as hell. And there is a question about the sort of psychology behind that. So he might mean it. He might feel that he is in some deep sense culpable, even though he's not specifically done the things that he's accused of. But it could also be read as a way of saying, in legal terms at least, as a process, this thing is a farce.
I think that's true. And some historians have, studying it very closely, concluded exactly that it doesn't take much to think he's saying, I could just take this apart. It's laughable. I suppose I see him more as accepting this sort of distinction between the objective big wheels of history, where we are now on the wrong side, and the smaller, very nearly subjective things like did I or did I not ever intend X, Y, or Z, and holding both and not being completely contradictory.
The line that really struck me, I'll just read it. This is quite late on, I think, in the speech. He said, "The point, of course, is not this repentance or my personal repentance in particular. The court can pass its verdict without it. The confession of the accused is not essential. The confession of the accused is a medieval principle of jurisprudence. But here we also have the internal demolition of the forces of counter-revolution." So one of the things that struck me about that is, given confession is the basis of all of these proceedings, it is the absolute bedrock of the whole case against all of them across the show trials. Here he is making the point, which many other people might also think observing this, which is a case built on confession. It is medieval. It is from a completely other world of legal proceedings because of all the ways in which that is suspect. And yet he ends by saying that's not the point of issue here. The point of issue here is almost the objective forces at work. And when I read that, I found myself thinking it's almost like he's saying, of course I am to be condemned, because here I am standing before you in a court where you can condemn me. I have clearly lost. I am on the wrong side. Given how we all feel about history, it's material, objective direction of travel. If you find yourself, as I do, about to be executed by the regime, I have lost. And that is where the guilt lies.
Yes, I mean, he does say some very complimentary things about the regime in the few sentences after that, doesn't he?
Well, they're also threatening to kill his wife and child. So there's a lot going on here.
He's not only saying I've lost it, he's also saying the wonderful Stalin is leading humanity. Where that famous sentence that to rely on confessions is a medieval principle of jurisprudence, somewhere in certain different parts of his speech, where it's sort of attached to some of the denials, I think it would have more force. And I think if you just lift it out, it has tremendous force. I mean, he's saying this whole thing doesn't stand up. But where it's located, I'm not surprised that Wyszynski didn't say, "Halt, stop the court, let's retire for a bit," because it's sort of so closely encased in, "but I'm wrong and you should condemn me," that it doesn't carry the weight that the words on their own seem to carry.
So can we talk about Koestler's Darkness at Noon, which is a book probably not as well known now as it once was. When I was a student, it was one of the things that you read, a sort of definition of being a student. You read Darkness at Noon, and it was thought to be one of the classics of 20th century political fiction. I think some of this has to do with Koestler's own reputation, which has gone into decline since his death. Indeed, the circumstances of his death. He committed suicide alongside his third wife, who some people think he coerced to commit suicide with him. And then he's turned out to have a history with women that doesn't stand up to scrutiny. So Koestler, his reputation is much more complex than it was when I was a student. Having said all of that, I still think it's a great book. And it was inspired in part by the speech that we've just been discussing, Bukharin, and the thought of how it might have gone for him under interrogation. So it tells the story of a fictionalized version of Bukharin. Number one is the name given in Darkness at Noon for Stalin, the Stalin figure. And he is described in the novel as being subject to torture, but it is the sleep deprivation, bright lights in the eyes version of torture. It's not the most brutal kinds of torture. And really the torture is psychological. And it, I think, purports to offer an account of how a man like that might end up confessing, or even as we've heard, he doesn't think the confessions are the key to it, but acquiescing in the process. And it offers various explanations for why that might happen, and we can go through them. But just overall, do you, as someone who knows this period, knows the real people, is this fictionalized account plausible to you? Does it ring true, or does it seem like a contrivance?
I too find it a fascinating book. I think the notion that Bukharin might right to the end think, I don't want to harm the party. The party will lead humanity to a better life, and say to his wife, as he did, bring our little boy up a Bolshevik. That sort of does ring true. But the notion that his whole position is voluntary, that this is him just wrestling with it instead of immense psychological torture and sleep deprivation and threats. No, I mean, he clearly was subject to horrible, horrible threats. So it isn't, that's where I find at least matches how I see Bukharin's experience. I think as a way of getting back into the kind of mindset so far removed from most of your listeners will have experienced, that worldview, it's a very good way to get into that worldview. He brings home the shape of Bolshevik thinking extremely effectively.
I mentioned at the beginning that the 50th episode on PPF Plus came out this week on Monday, and it's the fourth part of our recent series, Orwell's War. Here is a much shorter taster of what you can hear in that episode. So Orwell knew that anti-Semitism was being stoked by this war. Many English people complained that it was a Jewish war, not a war to save the Jews, but a war that was being fought for the Jews because the Jews secretly control things. But Orwell also knew that that racism pre-existed Nazism in England. Nazism had weaponized it. But there was anti-Semitism in England beforehand, and there probably would be afterwards too. What the Americans brought with them was, to use Orwell's language, the colour bar. And he didn't think there was extensively that kind of prejudice in England. So he was horrified to find himself seeing in London clubs and pubs start to ban blacks from entering. And he thought, I'm sure correctly, that this was being done as a sop to white American soldiers from the South who would spend money in these pubs and clubs and bars, but they wouldn't spend their money if their fellow black soldiers were allowed entry, because they came from a country, the southern United States, which was, it's worth remembering, the only polity in the world that Hitler really admired. Hitler was a big fan of the American South and its racist order. And that is what had arrived in Britain in 1944. There weren't German soldiers in Britain importing their vile racism. There were American soldiers in Britain importing their vile racism. And that was one of the features of the Second World War. James Baldwin, in his essays about his wartime experiences, remembers that one of the things that happened to someone from the North in the war was that they encountered for the first time Southern racism firsthand, because the army was a place where the South mixed with the North, and the South mixed with the North on the South's terms. Orwell found that Britain was now where that racism had been exported to, not just south to north, but across the Atlantic. And as someone who thought among the horrors of the British Empire was its racism, Southern-style American racism genuinely horrified him. This week we are putting 2 extra episodes out for you as well. 2 of our earlier collections from PPF Plus, from the archive. We put these out last summer, but we have lots of people listening to this podcast for the first time all the time. So over the next couple of days, 10 more extracts from 10 more PPF Plus episodes. If you would like to be able to hear the whole of all of these episodes and the 35 others that are there waiting for you in the archive, and all of our future bonus episodes, and ad-free listening, and automatic sign-up to our newsletter, do join PPF Plus now. Just go to the link in the show description or to our website, ppfideas.com. It costs £5 a month or £50 for the year. We would love to have you join us. If you go to the PPF Plus page on our website and scroll down, you can see a full description of each of the 50 bonus episodes that are available. Next time in our regular slot, it's the first part of a 2-part conversation with Helen Thompson about Peter Mandelson and New Labour, exploring the long history of that relationship, how to understand it, a comedy, a tragedy, and how did we get to where we are now. That's next time in our regular slot. This has been Past, Present, Future.